Om Haranmaye Parikoshe Virajan Brahmanisklam Tachu Brahm Jyotisham Jyoti Tadyadatma Vidhu Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Shining like burnished gold, highest and deepest, the core intelligence of living beings, partless and indivisible, ever pure, free of all taint, the essence in everything which all beings seek, either knowingly or unknowingly. There shines Brahman. It is that which the wise ones exult in, and it is that which the Guru teaches. Om peace, peace, peace. Om na tatra surya bhati na chandra tarakam nema vidyutobanti kuto yamagnihi Tomeva antumanabhati sarvam tasya vasa sarvamidam vibhati. Om shantihi shantihi shantihi. There, within the indivisible self of all living beings, the sun shines not, nor the moon, nor stars, nor fire, nor lightning, much less this tiny mortal flame. That one light shining, then all else shines. By its light, all is made radiant. May that singular light of pure conscious awareness enter into us, permeate us to the very core of our being. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Saha Viryam Karavavahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu, Ma Vidvishovahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman, divine reality, protect us. May it sustain us. May it illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. Today, in the second class of our three-class series on the Akshi Upanishad, we are reaching deep into the final slokas of that great scripture, Akshi Akshatam, that third eye Upanishad, you might say, that's hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the West, known more in the East, but even then in contemporary times, not so pronounced as the Upanishads that Shankara commented on in his brief life of 32 years. He did a good commentary on at least 9 or 10 of them, maybe 11, if the Svetashvatar Upanishad is one of those. So, whatever the case may be, these minor Upanishads, they're called, as what we've been studying more deeply in SRV since the Sequicentennial of Swami Vivekananda, his 150th year appearance on this earth, that we celebrated some years ago. And ironically, or symbolically enough, we're on the cusp of his birthday here too, which is late in the year, February 3rd, which is next Thursday, and followed by a late occurrence of Sri Ramakrishna's birthday around March. I think February 4th maybe for Swamiji and January 3rd for Sri Ramakrishna, if I remember right. So we're getting into the auspicious days of our particular ideals in SRV associations. meditating upon those three great beings who are the truth of life and existence. And so we, in the light of the sun god, gather together to inspect or scrutinize some of those great teachings that have been flowing forth from Surya Narayan, the sun god. And we've been into them for several years now. You can find the past classes on this Upanishad on our site, on our SRV site. And we're putting more of them all the time as they get recorded. But we are right at the end of that Upanishad study, and we'll have to take up another one. Which one, we're not sure yet. And where we're going to give it, we're also not certain of that because of the COVID virus scare that's going on. So in the meantime, we're fortunate to be able to stay close to home. And our SRV ashram here at Kedarnath and up at Badranath, about 30 minutes away, where we have these two little centers that a few people gather around and in for these worships, which is Bhakti Yoga, for these studies, which is Jnana Yoga, for early morning meditations, which is the Raja Yoga or Jnana Yoga, Yoga of meditation, and then infilled the rest of the 7 days of the week or many days of the month with Karma Yoga or Seva. That is how to selflessly serve other beings, free of the desire for fruits of our actions. So those four yogas are the new religion of this age, since we're talking about Swami Vivekananda and his great insights into today's day and age. He was with us most recently, 1902, I think, and went back to India to have the Maha Samadhi on the 4th of July, as we all know, and he gave up the body. So in that light, and it is real light too, as I just chanted, not Tattva Surya Bhati, it's not the light of the physical sun, but we are here studying Surya Narayan, the sun god, who is the origin of all suns in space. That is, if all suns are vibratory spheres, planets, objects moving in space, some of them quite huge, we're finding out with our outward inspections into the nocturnal skies. Huge suns out there burning. We could liken them to very powerful ideas that have been had here in the Burloka, which is the physical loka, which we translate into waking state, wouldn't we, if we were looking at the sun god's teachings. These charts particularly we've been looking at. And then from waking state we go to dreaming state, and from dreaming state to deep sleep state. And then beyond all states, called Turiya, or the fourth state, which would be the nirvana of Buddhism, the samadhi of Vedanta, at least seedless samadhi of yoga, asampragyata. So we have to make these translations from outer, connect them to the inner, and then go beyond outer and inner. Because consciousness is an indeterminable mass of pure conscious awareness. Therefore, take what is external and what is internal and render them into one state, because that's what they actually are. And then meditate on that state, pass your time contentedly via such meditations, and be free. Those words coming from that Shankara we just mentioned, who did his commentaries on some of these Upanishads and lived just 32 years. Such a spiritual protege in India back there in around the 7th century AD, with his great teacher Gaudapada, whom we will look at a little bit today as we take up some of these teachings of the higher limbs of yoga. There's a good image of Gaudapada there, you see, which is a guide chart to the 4 prakarnas of Gaudapada's Karka, which is itself a commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad. And so we are going to have some very powerful teachings today. Of course, if you approach these higher stages, as they're called here in the Akshi Upanishad, we like to compare them across the board to yoga's yoga and Vedanta's yoga. This would be the closest thing we could find to Vedanta's yoga. And it does lean definitely more towards the strictly Advaitic view, whereas Patanjali's yoga provides practice for us along the way. Have you seen any practice here, in a sense, that isn't very deeply interior, like in the mind? Whereas you're talking about outer moral practices, ethics, some asana, some breathing with the lungs, when you're looking at Patanjali's yoga. So that's a beautiful Ashtanga yoga that he put forth and composed. And in his time, they probably, taking an educated guess nowadays, around 140 AD. And then the Akshi Upanishad going back some couple millennia before that, most likely. But you can see then how long India has been thinking along this vein. And when you look at the non-dual or Advaitic side of it, you can't help but pick up several things you need to connect. One is the word, and two is how it connects to your states of consciousness, A-U-M, waking, dreaming, deep sleep. And then, of course, the Shvara of Om, the little one-eyed smile there, I'd like to say, that's not connected to the other part of Om as you write it, being the fourth, or Turiya, and or beyond name, form, time, space, causality, matter, thought, energy. That comes much later and much lower in the scale of things, when the sankalpa of collective beings deems it to be so, as they come down out of a non-dual state into a seated state, which would be like samadhi and yoga, and that seated state being deep sleep here. And then come further out into dreams, because remember, one of these stages is it gets beyond the tendency to dream. You want to try and get beyond that. And you gave up the waking state dream in the first stage, didn't you? By giving up the transmigratory life or reincarnation. Some rare souls, even in this day and age, are thinking along that line. If there's 7.5 billion people, how many million are actually monks, and how many other hundreds of thousands are dharmic householder devotees? How many millions are jnanis? And how many millions are devotees who just want to find the feet of the Lord and take refuge there? And then you'll find a cross-section of humanity in this world that is very dedicated to freedom, to enlightenment, and a kind of freedom that can be gotten inside of the highest form the human mind can conceive of. To quote Swami Vivekananda, which is of course Ishvara or Ishvari, the Divine Mother. So, waking, sleeping, eating, drinking, acting, or thinking, we have to resolve all our processes in Brahman. That's what those special souls do. And it's this point made in the Ramakrishna order, amongst some 5 million of us, and growing, that we find and resolve those processes via this vehicle of Shakti, the Divine Mother wisdom. And you can see her coming into the picture in Ashtanga Yoga. The very last sutra of Ashtanga Yoga is about her, Chitti Shakti, he calls her. And so this is, of course, the great tantric element inside of India, with the Shiva Shakti and the divine couple appearing. And of course that is right up the old spirituality for the Ramakrishna devotees, because with Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Sharada Devi we find the divine couple on the scene again in this very day and age, in the 1800s and into the 1900s. Both their great son, Swami Vivekananda, and the Divine Mother herself, Holy Mother, lived into the 1900s. So they're bringing that taste of ancient India that they live in always into the periphery, into the atmosphere, so that we can imbibe it. But we have to imbibe that with subtle senses. And we looked at that last week, didn't we? The subtle elements and subtle senses, the tanmatras, if you remember. How there's a flower and then it emits an odor, and its scent is picked up by the nose, and that's connected back to the power of smelling. And how all of this marches back inward. Most people would be, I smell the flower, that's it. Isn't it nice? And they wouldn't question the power of the nose to smell. or the god of smell, or the origin of smelling. That's where an inner life gets blocked off. That's where the origins of things are, you see. These are just the outer effects. And even in the outer effects you have cause and effect inside of the effects, don't you? So if you just keep getting into cause and effects over and over again externally, well, that's what's called the waking state. And what you want to do is put an end to that, and it'll take a few jumps within you. And that's why we were looking, and might as well remind ourselves of it, at the dissolution of the mind's stream. You can see how that in these slokas that we were studying, particularly when we got to the 5th stage of yoga. Remember, now here's this chart. I'm throwing charts at us real quick here, but there you see the 4th state was svapna, and we studied that in slokas 30, 31, and 32, and then we come to slokas 32, 33, 34, and we find that we're at this level of Sushupti pada, or deep sleep. We already looked at all the facets of the earlier yogas, because this was a chart I created just about 8 days ago and put it up. There was some wording problem with the 1st state. I changed that, although it wasn't exactly wrong in the first version of the chart. Put something like avoid nonviolence and compromise. It meant to say avoid compromising with nonviolence, but basically changed that wording to a better avoid violence and compromise, to make it a little clearer for people. And so with that correction in this brand new chart, we looked as far as the 4th state. Maybe just before we jump into the sloka, and I remind you of it, we can just look at that real quick in terms of what we're going to be studying in the 5th stage. It's summated right there in the earlier chart I showed you to say Sushupti pada means that's where the soul will encounter non-dual awareness. We'll have his first example of that, because it has to get beyond dreams. So there was a dream of life that was called the waking state, and there was a finer dream called the dreaming state. And those are appropriately named Jagrat and Swapna. So if you move inward in your consciousness, you're going to find that these states of awareness are vibrating differently, and they have different versions of tattvas in them. Like the 5 elements also, as I often say, they carry over into your dream state. You have earth, air, fire, water, and ether in the dream state too. If your senses are purified and honed, then your dreams are very real to you. And they can be as real as life here on earth to, you might say, lucid dreamers, an expression they're using nowadays. But the point of it all in the Vedanta is to find the origin of both states, waking and dreaming. And so that Sushupti pada here is called really your first state of non-dual awareness. And here we're looking at it then in terms of this Sushupti pada being accompanied by these 4 teachings. If you reach the 5th stage, we're calling it, of yoga in the Akshi Upanishad, you can live peacefully in dissolved mind. So that's why we're keeping this chart up while we look at this. Basically, dissolved mind has been demonstrated to us by this chart. Second, we practice seeing all as Brahman. So sounds then that we're not really perfectly adept yet to see all as Brahman, because there's still a practice going on that is taking you away from dual mind to non-dual mind, or from unripe ego to ripe ego, or from thoughts that are heavy and brooding to thoughts that are dissolved or ripened in the dharma, and Same with mind, taking it away from dual mind and graduating and being qualified to live peacefully in Brahman and to see all as Brahman. It's very subtle how the Maya or the avidya, the ignorance around that, goes away in people and comes dancing back. So watching that, the teachers who have taught students on this very rare level of Advaita, or qualified non-dualism leading to non-dualism, is what we're talking about here, Vishishta Advaita to Advaita. They're seeing how people slowly divest themselves of this subtler ignorance. Everything else has a gross and subtle condition. Ignorance must have too. It must follow you inward to a place where names and forms are still there, therefore the formless Brahman is still veiled. So practicing all as Brahman then becomes an allowable state. There's a nice phrase we like to use called Advaita Vedanta Sadhana. Kind of a contradiction in terms, in a way. If you had already arrived at Advaita Vedanta's realization, then you wouldn't need to practice anymore. You would just be a natural reflecting of that, like we saw Sri Ramakrishna in his life and Swami Vivekananda. But if there's still a sense of having to perfect, or you might say polish the diamond once you found it, or in Zen ox herding, once you found the lost ox, bring it home and take care of it. There are many ways in the different religious traditions that explain this subtle practice that goes on in the mind, as we're saying, because a lot of these earlier stages were practices that you accomplished with the mind. It's a very important part of Indian philosophy to realize this. And those who get stuck outward in the physical exercises only, or just at the ethical and moral level only, will never develop that refined awareness or living intelligence, as Vivekananda call it, that will allow them to enter into a state like this. Sushuptipada is a very high stage of yoga then. It also has there that you can then eventually exist in non-duality, as if that was always natural to you and you can't even remember what ignorance was like. Sort of like people nowadays trying to remember back what nursery school was like or something. Just doesn't occur anymore, as if it never existed. So this state of non-duality, and of course I'm fighting for words from here on inward. From here on out would be the expression, but for here on in I'm fighting for words. In fact, I'll let Gaudapada do some of the fighting for me when we show you the actual chart on the 4 stages of consciousness soon. But these little brief words are kind of suited to the task, because very few words are what you want to know about this. So live peacefully in dissolved mind, practice seeing all as Brahman, exist in a state of non-duality. Maybe in a sense even unbeknownst to you that you're in it. It's like the illumined don't really know that they're enlightened. They just have returned to a natural state of being. And then finally, enjoy eternally awake awareness, or what our founder, Lex Dixon, called the insomnia of yoga. So that's the full score on waking up. And at that point you would have to ask yourself, when did I ever sleep, or what was sleep like? I was always in an eternally awake state, but the tattvas, the body, my energy, my moods, the gunas, all these things we've studied at lower levels or denser levels of teaching of the Dharma now have fallen away, and it's just like living on consciousness alone, living in Brahman only. Now, this is stage 5 of this Akshi Upanishad teaching, and that's as far as we'll go, because we'll leave 6 and 7 toward next week. But we want to look at it in terms of how the Sun God is presenting it. So here's what he says, in case you have forgotten or need reminding. In Sloka 32, he says the first 3 states are said to be the waking state, And the fourth is called the dream state. And the mind dissolves like fragments of an autumnal cloud, if you remember that from last week. So the mind dissolving, if we want to take a look at this again, happened from gross or waking state, or A of Om, to subtle, the mind, or the U of Om, to causal, or M of Om, or the deep sleep state. This is the classic Advaita Vedanta teaching on it, championed or brought forward again by Gaudapada, probably around 500 AD, and posited there in the context, the human context, for great souls like Govindapada and Shankara, on down the line, all the way up to today's Swami Vivekananda, bringing it to us in the West, amazingly so, to try and ponder, like an Eskimo studying snow conditions, we sometimes say, borrowing that teaching. Examining our own consciousness to see what changes and what doesn't, and trying to adapt to the changes, and then remain impervious to them and remain ensconced in changeless reality. Akanda, Satchidananda, as Sri Ramakrishna liked to call that. So that sloka we had, and we also had 33. The one who reaches the fifth state survives, but as bare being. Due to dissolution of the mind in this stage, the manifold world does not present itself at all anymore. So it's as if everything remained the same, but all the differentiation got taken out of it. Like Gaudapada's description of non-dual awareness being, it's like concentration but stripped of all mental conceptualization. So it's as if the mental conceptualization made the differences in everything you saw. That is, if you were searching. If you weren't searching, it didn't really matter. It all looked the same anyway. But if you strip away the power of the mind to conceive things, sankalpa, vikalpa, which is a teaching Gaudapada puts his mind on, this level of teaching, he says, is only good for pointing out what vikalpa is. Otherwise, it's confusing. So if you can see through the mind's level to conceptualize, this is what you've been doing as you're building your base up the 7 stages of yoga, taught to you by the sun god, passed on to Samkriti, and then he comes back into the body after having the darshan and begins to pass it out to his students, and then they begin writing commentaries on it and so forth. So that's the way wisdom is passed from lineage to lineage, teacher to disciple, guru to shishya, in parampara fashion, we call it. Now, let's make headway and take up 34. Reaching the fifth state, called deep sleep, the sadhaka remains as pure non-dual being, all particulars having completely vanished. Having reached the fifth state, one stays consolidated in deep sleep, joyful, inwardly awake, all dual appearances gone. So you again would have had to try to focus your mind back to the world of duality, like Sri Ramakrishna did when he came out of Samadhi. It would have to be an attempt to try and see something other than Brahman there. And it's the opposite way with most people. If they're a practitioner, they're trying to get to a non-dual state and leave off the objects and see nothing but Brahman. So it's the opposite difficulty for great souls coming out of Samadhi. They're trying to understand how you see duality here, and maybe why you hold on to it, and how you get attached to it, obsessed with it, suffer from it. You have to try and put yourself at their level of understanding or perception, that they're coming from the non-dual down the ladder of these stages to encounter you, maybe help you, give you a hand up, and then going only so far and saying, oh, the rest are really not open to this and they're not interested in it. So really those 4 slokas there are about the fifth state, and then it starts into the sixth state. So that's why it's said there, looking inwards, even attending on outer things, that one appears indrawn, being extremely exhausted. That is too much trouble to open and close the eyelids, as the Avadhuta Gita says, Ashtavakra Samhita. It just became too much trouble to open and close my eyelids. Just wanted to stay in one state of mind all the time, because he had found the truth, and the truth had set him free. So, if we want to flesh that out a bit now that we've looked at this, and remember we left off last time in the dissolution of the mind stream sequence, we had taken up the tanmatras of odor, flavor, visibility, tangibility, and audibility. And then we wanted to look at the Pancha Pranas. And prana, according to Swami Vivekananda, being one prana in 5 forms. And him trying to describe for us the operations of our body that we don't see, that we don't live by food alone. And even if we study food and digestion and all those things, that's not really covering the subject of prana very thoroughly. You'd have to also take up your breath, for instance, and they don't. They just take up the functions of the digestive system and the bile and the phlegm and the heartbeat. They'll test that, and but the real crucial pranas are kind of left unknown and untouched, even at the physical level, I think. But when it gets to psychic prana, that's something that Swami Vivekananda said was very important for the understanding of today's Western cultures. That they don't have a concept of where the elements came from, except via evolution, from a void and so forth. And they don't have this inward ascension idea of tracing them back to a subtler origin, particularly in the mind. So this is part of the reason why you go waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, because when you're awake, you're waking, and when you're dreaming. So it sort of makes sense now that, number one, all of this is a dream, row, row, row your boat kind of idea that came to us. But that dream has to be inspected with a third eye, or with an ever-awake state, to find out where it came from. So these are inward ascension steps. 8 limbs of yoga, 7 stages of Vedantic yoga, but then you have these 4 stages of Advaita Vedanta, waking, dreaming, deep sleep. And this makes it more personalized. And more slimmed down to just 4 things. 3 things, really, kind of like the 3 worlds. And Gaudapada has something to say about that, which I'll share with you in a minute. But make sure that we've understand that when I've just read these 4 slokas, we've covered the 5th state. It's called deep sleep. The sadhaka remains in pure non-dual being, stays consolidated there, joyful, inwardly awake, and all particulars have vanished. Having reached the 5th stage, stays consolidated there, and even when it's attending on outer things, appears always indrawn, being extremely exhausted with all the things that it had to encounter back at earlier stages of awareness. That is, the concerns of the world are no longer calling it. And it's returning to a non-dual state. So we're beginning to get a sort of semblance of an idea of how non-duality works in an enlightened living human being, as rare as they are. So looking quickly then at dissolving the prana, let's see here from this chart, which is also only a couple weeks old, about dissolving the prana, because if you dissolve the outer prana into the inner prana, you can see here from this bubble in the chart, so we're concentrating on that, you can see the bubble inside the bubble of this meditator and how the 5 pranas are working inside. So basically he's got exhalation and inhalation. He's got inspiration, assimilation, and pervasion. So those are apana, prana, samana, vyana, and udana. The udana prana is is this inward moving, inspiring of thoughts kind of movement. So that's an important connection to make towards inspired mind, when all of a sudden mind realizes there's something more than the physical universe and the considerations there. Didn't we just say that? He became extremely exhausted with those things. So now he's lightening up, and when he gets a hold of the Udana, Swami Vivekananda says, that moves him in to a realization of what jnana is. You know, those two pranas alone are mentioned by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. None of the other three are mentioned. So it seems to me that these two are sort of seen as very important. How the soul moves inward via inspiration to the mind, to the subtle body, and also realizes that it's all pervasive everywhere, that this energy is flowing everywhere at all levels of being. So it's at that state of sort of simulating one's consciousness, that it can move through walls in a dream, that it can go beyond form in deep sleep, and therefore all of a sudden the idea is beginning to occur that everything's all pervasive. The consciousness permeates everything like sweetness permeates sugarcane juices, as Sri Ramakrishna used as a metaphor. But the important thing I want to make connection here is, because some people are aware of the 5 pranas, is let's connect him to the skies there in the elements. Basically, apana is exhalation. So if it comes to a psychic apana, that means expelling negativities. So just like the prana here will help you get rid of waste, get rid of impurities of the blood, get rid of negative thoughts, and so forth. The apana prana, that is its origin inside of your mind, is helping you expel negativities. So that's a good filter you're going to want to have if you're still occupying the human body. Many impurities there, in body, in energy, and in mind. So you can see how one just naturally gives rise to the other. Remember, now keep this in context with waking and dreaming. A and U of Om. So that when we do the dissolution of the mind stream, which is mentioned twice now so far in the Akshi Upanishad, that we know that this is a practice of a very high nature that's particular to the Upanishads. If there's any practice, I've often said, in the Upanishads, it's this dissolving of everything back to the source. And Lord Copula did that helped us with that when he came forth with the 24 cosmic principles at a much earlier time, so that we would know what to dissolve and who's doing the dissolving and what we're left over with when we have dissolved everything. That consciousness alone remains. Isn't that what we're saying here? Free from all innate impulses, attending on outer things, always indrawn, inwardly awake. These are words we're trying to grasp and borrow from the Sanskrit into English to help us give this indication of what it's like then for duality to disappear. Because it doesn't make sense if you don't have this as a guide. You can hear them say, well, all of a sudden all particulars disappeared. That doesn't sound possible, because your mind is still living in the particulars. So you don't know or have even an inkling of what it's like to all of a sudden go beyond particulars except in deep sleep. And you don't study deep sleep except in India. So I'm trying to put this together on the level of language again to show right now how when you dissolve the prana, this is a very crucial juncture that helps you with an inner life, so that you can take the word, dissolve it into the mind, dissolve the mind into the intellect, dissolve the intellect into the ego, dissolve the ego into the witness, and dissolve the witness into the Atman. And then dissolve that into Brahman, because Brahman is the heart and soul of everything. That's quote right out of Shankara's scriptures. So that's putting it as simply, much more simpler than this. This is taking it apart a little more. So back to this. If the gross prana then in exhalation is getting rid of your air carbon dioxide and so forth, and breathing in oxygen, then the psychic apana is that which just expels negativities. Go further. If the prana is the inhalation in the physical body of the lungs, the psychic prana is the imbibing of wisdom. It's going to help you open up channels in the mind, just like when you breathe, you open up oxygen to the brain. In that same way, one step inward, the psychic prana is opening up your ability to imbibe the teachings on Brahman. We chanted that this morning in meditation. Om Shrutehe Shatagunam Vidyan Mananam Mananadapi Nidijasam Lakshagunam Anantam Nirvikalpakam. So, Shrutehe Shatagunam Vidyan. It's very good to open up to Sravana, to hearing, Shrutehe, to hearing the scriptures. Open up to that. And then mananadapi, but even better if you take the scriptures in and meditate on them, contemplate them. Better still then is meditating directly on Brahman. That's nidijasa. And then finally, best of all, is that meditation finally where you understand it all, as it from the state of non-duality here, like when everything's dissolved, or when all the tattvas have been renounced and detached from, that you can attach and detach to and from them at will, as my teacher used to say. So you can see how two gross pranas are coming, two subtle pranas. You'll only find things like this in a bare mention in the Prashna Upanishad and in the Taittiriya Upanishad. If you're talking about 108 Upanishads, of those that are most known, these you're be giving some clues, but what I'm doing here is making an even a deeper inherent connection for everyone. If you go from the senses to the tanmatras, which are their origins, subtle senses, and then you have to understand the prana and dissolve that so that you can get deeply into the fourfold mind and find the Mahat, the great mind, as the origin of that, the God's mind. Then it's a junction here that people aren't navigating very well. The prana alone is hard for them to understand. Psychic prana, that's a deeper step. So let's take a look at then udana, because we said that was so important. So back at the physical level, that's inspiration, as your mind is beginning to get inspired. So if you take that prana inward to the psychic prana level, that's refining of wisdom. So when you get inspired, you understand more. So the psychic prana is there within the mind to take that wisdom that you're gleaning and refining it, fine-tuning it. They call that honing the intellect in Vedantic circles. Following this inner bubble around, we get to samana, which is the assimilation prana. So that on the physical level, assimilating nutrients into the bloodstream and so forth and so on. If you take that into the mind and have the psychic samana, that's the digesting of wisdom. So the prana helps you expel negativities, imbibe wisdom, refine it, and digest it. And that's pretty much what the outer prana is doing for your food. But man does not live by bread alone means when that food gets assimilated in the mind, there's 5 other pranas there that are actually helping to purify it, refine it, and digest it. So you can see how 10 pranas are like looking at each other face to face and leading to each other as you move inward. The final one there is jnana, or pervasion. So that's where the prana, the jnana prana, psychic prana, permeates thoughts. Now you can see, very important to seeing Brahman in everything, isn't it? So pretty soon the differentiations are going away. And the particulars have vanished, he says. And all dual appearances have gone, he says. And the manifold world does not present itself anymore, he says. See all of these in each of those slokas that are in the fifth yoga. That's a fifth stage, 32 through 37. Each of those things gets mentioned. So you can see how the psychic prana then, all 5 of those psychic pranas are leading you towards seeing Brahman in everything. So when you come to know this, then they're all working and they can dissolve everything. If thought becomes, if everything becomes wisdom after it's been taken in, refined, and taken up, sublimated, then that's key to pervasion. Now I'm beginning to see. I'm beginning to see everything. Thank you to these 5 psychic pranas then, and now I can move on and understand the fourfold mind, and that's what gets dissolved next. Manas, Chitta, Buddhi, and Ahamkara. And it put there in parentheses, with the psychic prana. You see. So, do you know your mind? Got mind? You do if you have the 5 psychic pranas under your mastership. And that's probably what most people do not have in mastery, so they don't know their own mind. And you can't know the mind by outer knowledge alone. Not by false knowledge, not by agyan, not by michigyan, not by aparavidya, lower knowledge. Secular knowledge, no. It only lasts for a little while, Swamiji says. If you really want to know the mind and all its processes, like you came to know the body and your energy, deha and prana, and senses, you came to know them and mastered them, then that psychic prana is going to have to be mastered by you. So here's where mananadapi and nidijasana come in, and also where the U of M and the M of M begin to take effect, your states of consciousness. At sloka 37, we've arrived at the 6th stage. Let's give this is about as much as I want to take you through. It's a big bite already, but to know how the 5 gross pranas are taken inside, become the 5 psychic pranas, has been mentioned by Swami Vivekananda in the Raja Yoga book. So that's something that we want to concentrate on right now, and how it turns in a direction that can help you dissolve the mind completely. That's why I said it's very good to dissolve all your processes into Brahman, but there has to be someone who can do that for you. That's the Maha Shakti, and that's what this chart leads to, the third eye and Maha Shakti. Basically, the psychic prana is going to give way to its possessor, and that's Divine Mother of the Universe, Shakti. Chitti Shakti, she's master of the power of your mind. Doesn't it sound like the power of your mind, these pranas? So this is adding in even more for deep consideration and hopefully profound insight. So now that we have dissolved successfully the prana into the psychic prana, into the mind, then we're doing this in accord with these 6 stages of yoga in the Akshi Upanishad. We call it Vedanta's yoga if we want. So let's go back quick, because it's good to take a review. This is actually not just a review, it's actually allowing us to see what's coming. That's stage 6. Now, in the Akshi Upanishad, slokas 37 through 40, a brief 3 slokas only are given to this 6th stage, and you see it's called Jivan Mukti. So this is where the soul becomes living liberated. So now you know why all the great Advaitic seers like Shankara and Gaudapada, and recently Swami Vivekananda, and the great souls that wrote the Jivan Mukti Viveka and other great scriptures like that are all up about it. You see, they're all in. to this concept. They would not look at it as a concept, but we're presenting it that way to people of the day and age. But they're entirely into 100% into this, how to put it, this revelation of Jivan Mukta, of Jivan Mukti. So you want to be a living, liberated soul. That's all of this is about. I mean, we can say everything in the world is just about that. Call it God realization if you want, or enlightenment, or whatever. But they have a way of putting it that's much more specific and not so general. It's just, oh, is he enlightened or not? But you could see how they've done it in the terms of giving up the world and the stages that we've looked at, and how that translates into how your consciousness gets refined in stages. So since the dissolution of the mind has been mentioned in 32 and 33 slokas by the Sun God, here is the chart on it, and then here is the process of doing it. And that's kind of what we're leading towards. And Jivan Mukti then is dissolved, is just only has three bullet points. One abides in fearlessness. One sees only oneness everywhere, and abides in the stillness of samadhi. So here's where samadhi particularly gets attained by the yogis, by the Jivan Muktas. So you can see the very subtle difference between the fifth state, Sushuptipada, but now you're heading more towards the Turiya state. And it's there that I want to read you some of Gaudapada's slokas from his commentary. I think you could probably take these in very easily. So drawing from, and we might as well show it to us now that we've gotten to it. Drawing from Prakarana 1. Part B. He says, when the sleeping soul, influenced by the beginningless Maya, is awakened, he then realizes the unborn, sleepless, dreamless, non-dual reality. So, he's not commenting on the Akshi Upanishad. He might as well be, but he's commenting on the Mandukya Upanishad. So, that sleeping soul has to be awakened and then realizes this true nature. So, I'm using these slokas to define something that's practically beyond words, as we were saying in that last chart. That is the Jivan Mukti state, the sixth stage of yoga in the Akshi Upanishad. He further says, if the projected creation really existed, it would continue, no doubt. But this projection of duality is all Maya's doing. In reality, there is only non-duality. Now, skipping ahead, because we're using these to describe the indescribable, we're skipping ahead to this other few slokas in his commentary. Thus, by prescribed exercises, one should practice control of the mind, which is often tossed about in desire and enjoyment, and even come to transcend both states of desire and non-desire. Seeing suffering, one should always remember the misery of this world, and then turn to remembrance of the unborn. For knowing it destroys the misconception of birth and becoming. One should fully awaken the mind, should pacify its desires when it is tossed about, and should not shake it up when it has finally attained equilibrium. Reaching samadhi, one should not relish pleasure, should remain free of attachment through discernment, and unify the mind by effort, should it move outward towards objects of the senses. The mind that does not lie low in sorrow, nor rise up and get tossed about in pleasures and desires, that mind, free of projections, has culminated all its processes in Brahman. That's one of my favorite of the commentaries. The wise say of it that it rests in nirvana, indescribable happiness, unborn and ever one, duly attended by omniscience. What is it like? No creature is ever born. No origination of it ever exists or takes place. This is the highest truth. So Gaudapada is very direct in his strict Advaita Vedanta approach to what we are calling or looking at right now as Jivan Mukta, or the Jivan Mukti. So that state has been described, as far as words can tell, by a great Advaitic seer there. And those were taken out of Prakarana 1 and 2. So you can see all of these other Prakaranas are there to even give us more of the understanding of these great souls. Now, before I forget, and we leave the subject of prana completely behind, it would be good to read a few of the things out of the Prajna Upanishad, especially what's called the fifth question. The questioner has asked about it by saying, about the origin of prana. And how it connects with the word Om. The question is asked, how many gods are there, and who supports the creatures? How many of them manifest it, and who is the greatest of them? And the answer comes, the ether is that God, air, fire, water, earth, speech, mind, eye, and ear. All of these manifest their power and say, we hold the body, we support it. But the chief prana then declared, we've just looked at the 5 pranas, do not be deluded. I alone, dividing myself into 5 parts, hold this body and support it. But none of these gods were prepared to believe him. So, in indignation, he went upwards from the body. That's Udana. He took everything up and out of the body into an inner state. And when he went out, all others went with him. When he came back, they came back. Just as bees go out when their queen goes out, and settle down when she settles down, so did speech, mind, eye, ears, all the senses, etc., come back and forth with him. That's with prana. Being satisfied, they then praised him. He burns this fire. He is the sun. He is the cloud. He is Indra. He is the wind. This bright one is verily earth, matter, what is and what is not, and also what is immortal. As spokes in the nave of a wheel, all are fixed in this prana. The Rik, Yagya, Samus, sacrifice, Kshatriyas, Brahmanas, everything fixed in the prana. As Prajapati, prana wanders the womb and is born. To thee, O prana, who dwellest in the body with the senses, these creatures carry all their offerings to you. Thou art the best carrier of the gods. Thou art the true effort of the rishis. Thou art Indra, Rudra, that's the Lord of all gods, and Shiva. Thou art the protector. Thou movest in the sky as the sun. Thou art the Lord of lights. This is right straight to the sun god himself, prana. O prana, you pour down as rain, and creatures are delighted, hoping that there will be food according to their desire. You are Vratya, the vows. You are the sacred fire. You are the universal Lord of existence. Thou art air which we breathe, O Father. Make propitious that body of thine which exists in speech and in our ears and in our eyes, also which pervades our minds. So there you have the outer pranas and the inner pranas. Do not go away from us. Whatever exists in the three worlds is all under the control of prana. O prana, protect us as a mother protects her sons. Give us affluence, give us intelligence. So I want to read that and more in the Prashna Upanishad. You can look there under the second question. And it goes further on in the third and fourth question. The students there gathering with Angaras, I think it is, this rishi is telling them the secrets of prana. And they're asking deeper and deeper and deeper questions. And by the time of the fifth question, all the subject is Om. So the whole thing leads from prana perfectly to Om, just as we're doing here in a more step-by-step fashion through these stages of Akshi Upanishad's yoga, 7 of them. And we've arrived at 6 now. And in the time remaining, which is enough time to inspect then some of these slokas in depth. So we just read about, for instance, reaching the 5th stage and then coming to the 6th stage. And what it would be good to look at there would be, if I refer here to my notes, an examination of these 4 states of consciousness, A, U, and M, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, and how Advaita Vedanta sets this forth for us in accordance with the full understanding that happens at the 6th stage of Akshi Upanishad's yoga, called Jivan Mukta. Jiva, the embodied, Mukta, free, so they're actually free even when they're embodied. That's the great goal of life. It's probably why most monastics in India give up the world and take to monasticism, is to develop that ability of Jivan Mukta in them. And or possibly some of them Videha Mukti, to even go beyond all bodies and not come back again. So we know that Lord Buddha had mentioned that, and a few others. But we just read from Gaudapada, and we were seeing how, in accordance with a lot of the mentions here in these 3 or 4 slokas, you see how it ends up with practicing this 5th stage free from innate impulses, which would be these sankalpas and desires, at a fairly refined state already. One reaches, as a matter of course, the 6th stage, called the 4th. That's a little confusing. The 6th stage of Akshi Upanishad's yoga is actually in line with the 4th state of your consciousness. So you're beginning to get to this, as it said earlier, non-duality, and understand it more, actually live in it. As you could see how those last 3 bullet points of that chart actually had to do with living in non-duality, seeing all as Brahman. You don't find a lot of information on those, even in the scriptures. So you have to kind of take them apart and infer with your own intelligence what all of this means and probably how it connects. The connections the seers are making inside of very high realized states are not things that are verbally possible to explain to people. You almost have to be in the room with them, getting some sort of a unspoken hidden transmission. It's a good word, transmission. So it's all about getting an injection of Brahmagyan. My teacher, Swami Sheshanandaji Maharaj, may peace and bless be upon him, used to say that. You get an injection of Brahmagyan. So Sri Ramakrishna said, like the master weaver, he can't really tell you how he discerns the difference between different threaded yarns. But if you spend enough time with him, you'll actually imbibe that ability without him saying anything. So there's a transmission that goes on even in the crafts, arts and crafts in the world. And how to get something of unspoken, deeper understanding from your teachers on all levels. And spirituality that attains particularly, that spend enough time in their presence, then you begin to understand things that you never read in the scriptures and you never heard from their lips. They knew it inside, and somehow it got transmitted to you. So that's one of these, the only word in English, 2 words actually, is sublimation of things. And then number 2, transmission, or an injection of Brahmagyan. So this is an old warhorse, Advaita Vedanta warhorse chart, and we've looked at it many times, but if you take it in right now at the level of the 6th stage of yoga, Jivan Mukta, you would be up here in it. And so you had already gone through the waking state where you were the enjoyer of things, and the physical universe was your home, and the body and senses were your mechanism, and cause and effect is what you were experiencing all the time. Pleasure and pain is what you were after, and false perception of reality is what you get. I don't think I've ever summated so quickly the Jagrot state, but that's pretty much it. You'll have to look back or take your notes on that. But you can also look at this chart. I'm going through the first 3 stages rather quickly here. So Swapna is the 2nd state, called dream state, and there you are Taijasa. That is, means you're the dreamer. So it really does go with the word dream state. Your locale is the mental realm, so you've at least dropped the body and senses. But remember, our dissolving of the mind stream chart, you've dropped the gross mind and senses and their objects, but you've taken on the subtle senses, subtle mind, and subtle objects, like heaven. It's like heaven. And so your mind is just characteristically just easily just dropped everything in the waking state physically and has gone to the dreaming state, picked up 5 new senses and a bunch of objects that are just mirror images of what you got back on earth. So that's officially now you're stamped in the mind. You've moved from waking to dreaming. The mechanism is the mind, it says. The condition is still cause and effect. The result is deception, because now you're deceived into thinking that the dream state is world. When you wake back up, you thought the waking state was real. So how was it that you don't still think the waking state is real when you go to the dreaming state? Doesn't show very much steadiness on your part, does it? So you're going to have to turn the key in the opposite way and realize that you have to go beyond both the external and the internal, that neither of those, because of their changing nature, is real. The result is deception then in the dream state. And in your view, whereas on earth it was false perception of reality, now it's a skewed perception of reality, Gaudapada says. This is all taken from this Karaka and summated so that we understand the A, U, and M of Om and the waking, dreaming, and deep sleep that goes with it, and in accord with these yogic stages. It gets less involved but more interesting to the seer in Sushupti. There you are pragya, at least you can give yourself that wisdom out of which everything else was made, and begin to realize that. But and you are the knower of that, and that's a causal realm you're in now. Remember, as you dissolve the mind stream, you've gone from the Fourfold Mind to the Maha. So now you're getting in more to an egg-like. See, Haran Maye, we chanted that at the beginning of the class, a kind of a cosmic egg where everything is returned to its seed states. And there's some very powerful beings in that, fully awakened powerful beings in that level of consciousness. They would be if they're Jivan Muktas, right? They would have to give up the body themselves at some time, and then they'd have the ability to return to earth and take on a body again. And so that's the wonderful abilities of those kinds of souls. as Krishna says in Gita, just sloughing off bodies and putting them back on, like when a child outgrows clothes. So they have that ability consciously to do that. But the condition has changed. The condition before was subtle cause in Sushupti, you see. It's subtle cause in Sushupti. The condition before that was cause and effect. So in deep sleep they say, and it's one of the great insights of Gaudapada and others, that cause and effect persists in waking and dreaming, but the effect goes away in deep sleep. So it means that you've found the origin that you've been looking for when you entered into the practice of dissolving the mind back to Brahman. So somewhere along there you dissolve the word into the mind into the intellect into the ego into the witness. When you get to the witness, that's beginning to suggest this deep sleep state. And effect goes away. In fact, I'm the effect of everything. I'm the cause of everything. And all of those are the effects. And I think I will just stay in cause now. Deep sleep is I will just not birth them anymore. I'll not project them. I'll not engage in sankalpa or vikalpa. And enjoy the state that was just being described here to us, right? Free from all impulses. Inwardly joyful. Liberated in life. Giving up attending to outer things. Always indrawn. Just going up back through these slokas. Everything consolidated in deep sleep. Just all the processes dissolved back. Only one more step to go before the final process of seated samadhi gets resolved into seatless samadhi. If you want to quickly grasp for something, for a handhold there on that cliff of non-duality from the father of yoga. That's why he put together those 4 seated samadhis leading to the seedless samadhi. Then you had a sort of ladder to know what your consciousness was doing as it climbed higher and higher. In Sushupti, and I went more and more on about subtle cause there, but the result is a kind of veiled bliss. So because we don't remember when we come out of deep sleep what we experienced there, but we feel totally refreshed, whereas dreaming for a long time makes us very tired in our waking state. The people who don't connect the waking to the dreaming state have one problem, but the real problem is if you don't connect those two to the deep sleep state, and you're not conscious of going formless, or not conscious of higher state of mind, where maybe mind itself gets dissolved in this process. Maybe even God's mind got dissolved along the way. So dissolve the witness into the Atman, Atman into Brahman. So all mind goes away there, even the mind of the great. The great means Mahat. Mahat means cosmic mind. So that dissolution is very profound. They have different ways of explaining that too, in terms of time and timelessness particularly. But however, and unfortunately, the view in Sushupti, whereas the view in waking state was false, in dreaming it was deceived. But here it's non-comprehension, so that's not a good thing. So you visited deep sleep. It was a nice place to visit, but I can't lay down roots there or stakes because I'm not fully qualified for that. See, so that might describe the difference between the 4th stage of yoga and the Akshi Upanishad. That's why you need all these charts up at one time, so we can quickly refer to them. But it describes the difference between the 4th state and the 5th and 6th state, which is brooking Sushupti, and is beginning to understand non-duality and enjoy it very much. Enjoy, of course, being a word that you probably should replace with ananda or bliss. So a person that's arrived at the 6th state and I'll read those sutras for you now, those three of them. Practicing the fifth state, which is free from all innate impulses, one reaches as a matter of course the sixth stage, called Turiya, the fourth, where there is neither the non-existent nor the existent, neither I nor the non-I. With all analytical thinking gone, one remains alone, totally fearless in non-duality. So, have no hope for me forevermore, I'm gone and gone forever, as Lord Buddha had said. And then, the last of those three slokas here in the sixth stage, it's beyond all knots, with all doubt vanquished, liberated in life, devoid of imagination, though unextinguished yet extinguished. That one is like a painted flame. Sort of like Yata Dipo Nivataste Nongate Sopamasmrita, a candle in a windless place, as Sri Krishna describes it in the Gita, Bhagavad Gita. So they're trying to explain in Sanskrit, and then we're trying to translate that into English here in that way. But I think it's very key beyond knots. So I want to show you something about Granchis in a minute. But those are the three slokas then that pertain to the Jivan Mukta stage. And then we might as well see what Gaudapada says about the fourth, because it's mentioned right there. In the fourth state, the locale is Brahman. It's like the only place there is Brahman. There never was anything else but that. But you have to look back on the fifth state to remember that you lived in non-duality and you saw Brahman and everything, right? So by now, when you get to the fourth, Turiya, that is, which is the sixth state of Sushupti, you're getting used to the idea that all is Brahman. And the mechanism, whereas before was the body-mind mechanism and all that, now it's just consciousness. Kevala asti, I think, is there in the Sanskrit. It's that alone. One goes to that alone. I am alone. I am consciousness alone. That's all I am. That's all I ever was. Everything else was what? Due to innate impulses. See, earlier. Sankalpas, vikalpas, desires, going on down the stage. Even though they got more and more refined as I became masterful at the psychic prana, which could have been a problem, because then I could have enjoyed myself with the psychic prana instead of realizing myself with the psychic prana. So this is why you go inward and past the occult powers, as both Vivekananda and Patanjali have stated, and Sri Ramakrishna has stated, so that you can get to these higher levels of non-duality. And that is the condition there, non-duality. The condition earlier was subtle cause and effect, but now there's none of that there. Even deep sleep has been transcended. There's no cause, because out of the deep sleep state the dream comes, and out of the dream the waking state comes, and when you go to sleep the waking state goes back to dream, and then the dream state goes back to deep sleep. So this is still cause, isn't it? But now you've erased the cause, not just the cause and the effect, but the actual cause, which is the reason why you dissolved the mind stream in the first place. And it's also the reason, alternatively, why people can't. They stay in the waking state thinking it to be the only reality. So they're never going to understand the finer dynamics of Advaita Vedanta, so well outlined by great seers like this. Why they come back and share that with people on the earth, I can only imagine it's just for the few. Only the few are understanding it. And maybe many of them are having a hard time with that kind of subtlety, how to go formless. But I look everywhere, I don't see any other place but in India. And I have a God blog on it now, and I have a chart growing out of it now, that the revelation of, India's revelation of formless awareness, where else is that anywhere? And we are actually studying it right now, as far as words and scriptures can tell, from the minds of these great souls who live there So they come back, and a few understand what they're saying somehow. How this all is Brahman, how it's just consciousness, and how it's just non-duality. And the result of it all is not happiness anymore and sorrow, or deceived awareness, or veiled awareness. It's unalloyed bliss. Vilapya shantim paramam bhajasva, Shankara says in the Vidyachudamani. That's how they enjoy unalloyed bliss and eternal peace. Parama bhajasva. So, vilapya shantim. So they have this peace that's passes all understanding, and they have this unalloyed bliss. Parama bhajasva. And so that's how they got it, through this inner journey, this inner ascension, this transition back to the source. And dropping all the overlays that they took on when they came out. Some of them taking them on purpose to avail themselves of them so that they can help others, the Jivan Muktas. Some of them moving into them once, dropping them immediately and going back into Videha Mukta stage, never to come again. I hope for the sake of all the Christians that Christ is coming once more, if that's what they think. Because there are many, many souls of that level of awareness that will not come back again. And once is it. And you're going to have to look after other beings called Jivan Muktas. And that's why it's important to study the sixth stage here. It's because that's where these souls who are really helping you come back from. They won't dissolve into the seventh stage yet, but we'll look at that soon. The view is all-comprehending. The view before was what? Non-comprehension of reality in deep sleep, skewed perception of reality in dreaming, and false perception of reality in waking. So this is a very good chart, I must say, that I put together as a consummation of everything of that nature pertaining to Om, A-U-M, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, that Gaudapada had to say in his Karaka. And with those fine points, what is the who is the individual? What state is he at? Where's the locale he's in? What's the mechanism he's using? What's the condition that's all around him? What's the result of that state? And what's his view? And how that graduates, or how that graduation does not happen. You fail the course and just go back to commonplace thinking, or suffering, even worse. So all of those things, that's why my teacher would say at the beginning of many of his talks, I salute Gaudapada, because he was an illumined soul. He would start out his talks to us that way. And so now you can maybe get a little inkling of why great souls like the Swami, my guru, was in such reverence of souls like Gaudapada, who had, like Kapila with the Tattvas much, much earlier on, had done their deep homework on Advaita Vedanta and been able to put it into some kind of verbiage for us. For what reason? To help us remember that that's our true nature, or to help us move through subtle blocks in our dreaming and deep sleep stage, to help us master consciousness. Like our Atman, help us to be our true nature. There's just a few minutes remaining in this half, and I can think of no better way to spend those 2 minutes than to read you about 5 slokas that I put together from the Gaudapada's Karaka that are very beautiful about this highest state called Jivan Mukta, or Turiya. He says, perceiving the suffering of this finite world, one should turn to the Atman. And that's just what the Sun God said here. We read that exact thing right here. When mind enters Atman, its variances are seen as unreal. So mind cannot go to Atman without just showing everything that it's limited. It tries to fit into Atman. Oh, sorry, you can't. Unless you dissolve yourself, you cannot enter. You see. Then peace descends. Atman is like intense concentration without end, but free of conceptualization. That's probably the best way I've ever heard Atman defined, right there. It's free of conceptualization, but it's unending, intense concentration, the kind that you'd like to achieve in meditation, for instance, or in study of scriptures and so forth. Atman has neither destruction nor origination, bondage nor salvation, nor emancipation. This is the highest truth. In its dynamic phase, it diversifies entities. Those few who recognize Atman's envisionings perceive its beauty everywhere. For them, no difference between Jiva and Atman exists whatsoever. Thus they declare, non-duality alone is auspicious. Beautiful summation, not just a description, but a summation of a knower of Brahman, and how he would express that to you if he had to leave it behind in a scripture that is now some 1600 years old. Namaste, and we will end our first half here.